I'm not on yet. Hi, welcome to A Mirror Darkly, Unbridled Inquiry. I'm Ruth, this is Robin, and today we're bringing you the topic, what is anti-Semitism today? So we'll start that in just a minute. We have a co-host, this is Oriel. He's visiting with us today, so he doesn't have to stay home by himself. So he enjoys going everywhere that I go, so especially today because he discovered the fish in Robin's office and wants to eat them, so it kept him very busy for a while. I will let you know that we are having internet issues.
As if they can't tell.
Yeah, as if you can't tell. We're aware of it. It's probably the wind outside.
It might be the high heat.
Yeah, it's also incredibly hot. We're under an extreme heat warning. So anyway, that being said, hopefully you'll be able to get enough of the information because this is a really important topic in our country and around the world today. So we'll go ahead and get started. Just remember that we do the show in 10-minute segments. So if you have a question or a show topic, we'll address those at the end of each 10 minutes. And I do apologize, the internet is like bad today.
Yeah. Okay. Yeah, it's noticeably bad, not just for the streaming, but for everything. So, at least here at the church. So I even tried rebooting the router and the modem, and that's not solving the issue. So I don't know what's going on. I assume it's on the end of our internet service provider more than us.
Okay. We'll blame it on them.
Why not?
Sure.
Anti-Semitism is hostility toward or discrimination against Jewish people as a religious or racial group. The term anti-Semitism originated in 1879. It was a term that a guy by the name of Wilhelm Marr came up with. And it was used as to designate the anti-Jewish campaign underway in Central Europe at the time. Sometimes people think that the term anti-Semitism could be used for other Semitic-speaking groups, but the word has never been used for anything other than against Jewish people. So that's the origin of the term and what the term is used for. Exclusively. Like I said, it had origin in 1879 in Germany. Not a big shock that it should come out of Germany, I guess, given what happens a few years after the term was coined. Anti-Semitism has existed to some degree wherever Jewish people settled outside of the Promised Land. And so we see it, for instance, one of the more famous incidents is with Esther and her uncle Mordecai and all the things that happened to them as a consequence of the evil Haman, whose name is not to be pronounced, at least during Purim time. But he would be the first example of extreme anti-Semitism that we see historically speaking. There is a certain amount of that also during the time of the Romans. The Romans did not like the people of Israel. They found them difficult. For that matter, you can go back a few years to Antiochus Epiphanes and the things that he did, which gave us the holiday Hanukkah, because he tried to force the Jewish people to convert to worshiping the Greek gods. And of course they refused, despite his best efforts, including sacrificing a pig on the altar in the temple, the cleansing of which is where the holiday of Hanukkah comes from. After the time of the Roman Empire, as we move into the Middle Ages, then you see Christians being responsible for a lot of the anti-Semitism that exists in Europe following that. The Christians, for whatever reason, end up blaming Jewish people for the death of Christ. They come up with something called the blood libel, which is a weird notion, which oddly enough was originally attributed to Christians by the Romans. The Romans, during the time of early Christianity, when the Romans were persecuting Christians, claimed that Christians were cannibals. and that when we took communion, because it says, "This is my body, this is my blood," they said that's what we were actually doing. We were eating people. Somehow that morphed into the blood libel against Jewish people, and the idea that the Passover Seder, the matzah, is made out of that is one of the key ingredients in that, according to blood libel, is the blood of a Gentile child. Obviously, both for Christians and Jewish people, this is nonsense. The Mosaic legislation is rather explicit, and it continues with Christians as well, that we are not supposed to eat or consume blood of any sort. So it's utter nonsense. The weird thing about the blood libel, though, is that it has endured. The last time in a quote-unquote Christian country that someone was arrested for it was in Russia around the late 1800s, in the 1890s. Since then, it has become a staple of anti-Semitism in the Muslim world. In fact, as recently as about the year 2000, maybe shortly after that, there was a mini-series on one of the major television networks in Egypt, or at least they're the ones that did it, and that was broadcast all over the Middle East, where that was the topic of the mini-series, was the blood libel. They had, rabbis going out and kidnapping Gentile children and killing them and making matzah out of it. So if you're curious to see at least excerpts from that, I'm not sure that the whole thing is on it, but if you go to memory.org, MEMORY stands for Middle Eastern Media Research Institute. And what that place does is they take the media, that is all the TV broadcasts, radio broadcasts, newspapers, television, whatever, political cartoons, and they translate them into English. And so if you're curious as to what's going on in the Arab-speaking world, that's a good source. And the sad reality is that anti-Semitism is extensive throughout the Muslim world. The reason for that, though, is Germany. Because in the 1930s, as Hitler had come to power and he's pushing an anti-Semitic agenda, he made inroads through propaganda into the Arab-speaking world, because those Arab-speaking nations across northern Africa and into the Middle East were all controlled by England and France. And so he was trying to pry those colonies away from British and French control, and to create problems for the British and French, and to create discord and turmoil, and was quite effective. In fact, the leader of the Muslim people in what's today Israel and Jerusalem, the Mufti of Jerusalem, he actually actively worked with the Nazis during World War II. He did radio broadcasts in Arabic for the Nazi regime, and he raised or brought together a lot of troops from the Arab world to fight on the side of Germany. Modern Arab or Muslim anti-Semitism as it exists, particularly in, was a horrible, or still is because he's still alive, is a horrible anti-Semite. I'm friends with a person on Facebook. I had written an article, blog post for the Jerusalem Post a while back, and he friended me. And he wrote a book entitled Left Anti-Semitism, because right parties, but now it has made inroads into
Extreme left.
Well,
we see that in the United States.
We see that in the United States with, for instance, AOC and
Ilhan
Omar and Rashida Tlaib.
Yeah.
Rashida Tlaib and Omar both are anti-Semites.
Well, and Ilhan Omar is Muslim, so it makes sense that they would be.
Yeah, because that's what they were exposed to growing up, because they come out of that world that exists in the Middle East. And it's very sad. But anyway, the person that friended me on Facebook he was a member of the Labor Party for his whole, his whole adult life. He's a professor at a university there in England. And he left the Labor Party explicitly because of Corbyn and what he has done to the Labor Party. And it's still a significant problem in the Labor Party in England. It has not gotten. It was common. Jewish people would not be allowed to attend certain Ivy League institutions, Harvard being one of them. There would be places that Jewish people were not allowed to live. There would be housing, agreements among homeowner associations that, we won't sell our houses to any Jewish people. And you'd see that in the paperwork that, you're not allowed to sell this to a Jewish person. And you see it reflected to some extent even in some of the choices, for instance, that Franklin Roosevelt made during World War II. It is the consistent refusal to ever attack any of the infrastructure associated with the final solution. That is, they didn't bomb the railroad tracks going into Auschwitz and things of that nature, despite the fact that they had intel as to exactly what was going on. And they did absolutely nothing to try to do anything about it. And worse than that, Jewish people trying to escape from Europe, they found it very hard to get out because most countries, the United States included, would not allow them to come into their country. And so a lot of them ended up having to go back to Europe, where they were rounded up and sent to the death camps, and they died. Anti-Semitism has been a serious problem for a very long time.
Was that the big impetus for the forming of the Nation of Israel?
Yes, part of the reason the Nation of Israel was founded, as you go back to the Zionist movement that began at the end of the 19th century, the motivation for creating a Jewish state was precisely this, to try to get away from all the hatred and anti-Semitism and persecution. Dreyfus was a colonel, I think it was, anyways, or lieutenant. He was in the French army, and he was falsely accused of treason, and the reason for it was because he was Jewish. Now, eventually, leadership at the time were literally Nazis. They had worked for Nazi Germany during World War II. And so the UN told them to essentially go F themselves. They did not care what those Palestinians had to say because they were close to being war criminals. So anyway, the various Arab states around Israel attacked on the day that the UN voted, and they lost. And Israel, the Jewish state, survived. It actually gained a little bit of territory from what the originally Arab state that was supposed to have been created. The West Bank was absorbed by Jordan, and the Gaza was given. There was no talk of creating an independent Palestinian state. Nobody complained at Jordan and Egypt having absorbed those areas. In 19, you have this, and they were bankers. Now, the reason that
when they really did exist.
Yeah, the Rothschilds actually exist. They still do.
Okay.
But in anti-Semitic thinking, the Rothschilds are in control of the economy of the world, and they're evil, manipulating people that are trying to destroy society through their ability to control economies.
Well, with the inflation going on, I think they need to step up their game and get things under control. If they're really not doing a great job right now.
But it's, again, I summarize the idea that Jewish people are all rich and controlling of all the money in the world. And I know a lot of poor Jewish people that would like to get a piece of that action, but it's not real, is the problem. And actually, if you stop and think about the richest people that you ever hear about in the news, how many of them are Jewish? None. That is, Jeff Bezos is not Jewish, Elon Musk is not Jewish, Rockefellers are not Jewish. That ended up in finance and in banking is because that was the only jobs they were allowed to have. Again, anti-Semitism has been extreme in European history, and one of the things that they did is they controlled what Jewish people were allowed to do, where Jewish people were allowed to live. And so they were excluded from most professions.
There are also a lot in the entertainment industry, so it was probably...
And part of that is, again, the same thing, because that was an industry they could get into. They couldn't get into. So major universities like Harvard. I'll pick on Harvard because if you go back and look at their history in the 1930s, particularly heavily anti-Semitic. And when he escaped the Nazis and got here to the U.S., it was hard for him to find a place that he could teach. He ended up at Princeton because Harvard wouldn't have him because he was Jewish. I do not like Harvard. And they haven't changed a whole lot. That's the other thing. You still have a lot of that kind of problem going on there. But anyway, back to the problem that Jewish people had, even in the U.S., is that they were excluded from educational opportunities even. That is, a lot of the major Ivy League institutions had restrictions on how many Jewish people they would allow to come there. Kind of like what Harvard does today with Asians. And a lot of other institutions. Racism and bigotry are a widespread issue among those that most scream about how they want to
get rid of institutional,
and yet they are responsible for a lot of the institutionalized racism. It's tiresome. The reason that a lot of Jewish people are in certain industries is because of this. Jewish people play the violin. It's because it's really hard when you're running away from the pogrom to carry a piano with you.
Right.
That's an old joke.
If I were a rich man, too.
Yes. Well, that's the other thing, too. I mean, if you watch, obviously not. I mean, it's a stupid thing.
Well, and